Hello and welcome to our Hidden Architecture series. Today we're going to talk about how excellence whispers before it shouts. I was very fortunate to have had two really unique experiences in my law enforcement career. I got to work for two agencies, and they couldn't have been more diametrically opposed. And that was a very beneficial thing for me because I could see how one worked and one didn't. And this is a little bit of a story about that. The first agency, really, you could describe it as a bit of a daytime soap opera. A lot of tension, a lot of drama, things happening all the time. And the idea was most of the people working there were kind of what's in it for me rather than how can I serve. It'd be a good way to sum it up. We also had what I affectionately call a number of RODs, officers that were retired on duty. What does that mean? Well, they would just dismiss as much as they possibly could, get out of as much work as possible. Their goal was to kiss off as much as they could and not serve the community. They really had a feel like it was us versus them, and they expressed this a lot in their languaging and how they went about doing business. The other thing that was challenging about that was it was a good old boys network. And what I mean by that is who you knew was more important than the work ethic you brought to the process. In fact, the hazing was pretty brutal, especially if you were a newbie right out of the academy. But those officers that dedicated themselves to operational excellence, that always went above and beyond, that had new ideas, new ways of improving things, that would go to training on their own dime because the department wouldn't provide it, they were pretty much ostracized. And the officers who knew people who were well connected but not necessarily doing a very good job, they got all the perks, they got all the rewards. And at the end of the day, that's a fairly toxic culture. I think that I could categorize that first agency experience as definitely a definition of what that looked like at that point in time. And I noticed that the best of the best were all leaving. They were heading to greener pastures. So I watched carefully. Greener pastures, yeah, that doesn't always work out. But in this case, it absolutely did because those officers did their homework, finding agencies that were more supportive of that passion, that operational excellence that was just natural to how they showed up. It was like their DNA. Well, I was that way too. I was just naturally driven. And I really like to think outside the box. I like to look at systems and tweak them and experiment with things that might make them even better. And that was definitely not going to get me anywhere in that first agency. So I watched and I left too. And when I picked a new organization, one of the things that was really interesting is I went up there for a ride along to see what the organizational culture was like. And you could feel it from the moment you walked in the door. This was a fit for me. You walk in the lobby, the first person to greet you is a civilian front office person, and they are in a uniform, looking sharp, eye contact right away, enthusiastic that you're there for a ride along and that you might actually be joining the agency, like you were just embraced and welcomed. You walked into the front office of my first department and you got, "How can I help you?" I mean, just you could feel the exhaustion, the malaise. There was no vitality. This first representation I find as I walk through the door, vital, engaged, present, so refreshing. And then I went in and to the briefing, and I noticed that the officers were really engaged with each other. They were laughing, they were jovial, they were connected. It felt kind of like a family. And the uniforms, sharp, tailored, polished. Officer presence was amazing. I loved it. And then we get in the briefing, and there was an obvious pride in the organization itself and how they went about true community policing. As I said, that first agency, a bit more us versus them. This agency, how do we serve? And I noticed sitting in the briefing something really interesting. There were several new officers going through the field training program right out of the academy. No hazing, no disrespect. It was about How can we help them grow? How can we help them as a team? Not just the field training officer, the entire team they were on embraced the new folks and was giving them a hand and a leg up on everything. I also noticed something else that really took me by surprise, because during the briefing something came up that they were discussing, and officers had some dissent, some counter opinions to what was happening, and they were embraced for that. They weren't put down, they weren't pushed away. It was like, yeah, what do you got to say? How could we make this better? Oh, that's a great idea. So everybody had an equal voice. Needless to say, I joined this agency and it was an immediate fit because they embraced my passion, my operational excellence. They rewarded me with training and promotions and really loved the fact that I was an outside the box thinker who liked to push the boundaries. Nothing was off the table. So it was a perfect fit, and it was where I thrived from that point on. Now, here's something interesting about this that is really an important point about these whispers of excellence. We went through 5 chiefs during my tenure. That's a lot of different leadership and a lot of different leadership styles, but it didn't matter. No matter what leader came in and how they wanted to kind of hone and tweak things, operational excellence was an artifact of culture within this organization because it was built and designed to be so. Everyone owned it, top to bottom. So even when a leadership change happened, the bottom line of operational excellence remained the status quo. Always pushing, always seeking, always innovating, always leading. And that was our reputation throughout the entire state of California. So the DNA of that organization was deeply embedded. Again, excellent whispers below the scenes. It's that invisible force you feel when you walk in to the organization that is vital and really architected correctly. That's because they took the time to build the systems that would support that. Stay tuned, because in our next episode in this Hidden Architecture series, we're going to look at some of the breadcrumbs that organizations leave behind that we can gather up and potentially apply into our own organizational structures to make them better. I'm Roger Ruge, the Chief Resilience Officer for Pathfinder Resilience, and I don't believe cultures of excellence happen by accident. I believe they're architected.